This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Find a better and more fun way to learn online today. The second half of the 19th century was the beginning of the new imperialism era, which was a time that Europe renewed its colonization efforts. While the first era of colonization mostly targeted the Americas, this era would involve attempting to colonize, well, basically everywhere else it possibly could. Plus, this time a little later in the game, the United States would join in, making its own empire of colonies. Japan would also join in as well by the end of the 19th century, which wouldn't have happened if it had never ended its isolationist period, which happened mostly because the United States basically threatened them to do it. East Asia during the era of new imperialism was in a unique situation in that they weren't fully conquered like Africa, India, or Australia, largely because it would have been infeasible to entirely control. So aside from a few leased territories that were basically coastal ports, there wasn't so much a direct imperial colonization as much as an economic one. East Asia had a large population and a large economy of its own right, and Europe was eager to make money from that. However, China didn't need to make disparaging economic deals because its economy was so huge, so they often were forced to. Japan, meanwhile, was fully isolated from trading with anyone besides the Dutch, and Korea was beginning to lead towards isolation as well into the 19th century. The United States tried various methods to convince these countries to open up for more trade in the mid-19th century, like in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry famously took warships to Japan and basically used gunboat diplomacy, which means threaten with naval warfare, for Japan to open up. Japan eventually agreed, which would set in motion for the end of the shogunate. After this success, the US would find its ships hanging out more in the waters off of East Asia and figured, hey, if that works for Japan, why not try Korea? In July of 1866, a random businessman named W.B. Preston used his ship, the General Sherman, to go to Korea and try to pull off another Matthew Perry and open up Korea for trade. However, since Preston wasn't going under the US Navy's banner, he had to make do with just a few buddies, like an English pirate and a bunch of random Chinese and Malaysian sailors. So not exactly the most professional bunch, but he was determined. As they traveled along Korea's coast, having just recently been in China, the members of the ship passed out Bibles to locals who kept warning them that it was illegal for them to be there, and they were ignored. However, the expedition would run aground when entering the Taedong River, and they overestimated the water's depth. So once they were stuck, they decided to send a rowboat out to forage. However, a Korean ship featuring a deputy to the Korean official named Bak Gyusu found him. Realizing that they were in trouble, the crew of the General Sherman decided to take that deputy hostage when he tried to negotiate for the merchantman's release. The crew then demanded rice, gold, silver, and ginseng for his release. The Korean civilians who lived near the river were naturally observing the situation, and upon the hostage situation, they decided to take matters into their own hands and use whatever makeshift weapons they could find to try and stop the crewmen of the General Sherman, such as throwing rocks, using homemade bows and arrows. Oh yeah, and they also used rocket launchers. Yes, you heard me, rocket launchers. During the confusion, the deputy was rescued. Upon being assaulted by the citizenry, the crew decided to fire back with the General Sherman's cannons, which ended up killing 7 people. Eventually, Korean reinforcements arrived, first trying to navally storm the ship but failing, and then eventually they decided to set a collection of small wooden boats on fire and pushed it towards the General Sherman, which didn't catch on fire. But the foraging merchantman who was still in his rowboat did catch on fire when the debris bounced off the General Sherman and arrived at his boat. The crew of the General Sherman did decide to abandon ship anyway, and upon arriving ashore were all killed by the citizenry. Since this wasn't a Navy crew, the Koreans weren't able to identify the ship as American and assumed that it was British or French, especially since there was a rising drama between Korea and France at the time over the mistreatment of Catholics. France would, funnily enough, try to force its way past Korean isolation in October that same year over that same tension, but they did not succeed. Despite Korea moving on, America didn't. Since the US was never contacted about the incident, all they know about the situation is that the General Sherman and its crew went missing upon arriving in Korean waters. So eventually they decided a few years later to send a force to investigate, but that would end up starting another incident. But before we move on to that, I'd like to take the time to talk about this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and app with a hands-on approach to learning about subjects such as science, math, computers, and many others. Their courses help you learn about a subject by doing it with challenging problems, visualizations, and interactive experiences. From my own personal experience, when I'm trying to learn a subject that doesn't come to me naturally, I find solving puzzles and problems a very helpful way to reinforce what I've learned. So Brilliant is perfect for that sort of thing. Brilliant recently increased the interactivity on their platform even more, so there's even more ways to manipulate objects on screen to help with your learning. You can already imagine how this would make activities such as math puzzles much more intuitive and helpful. Considering math and science aren't my best subjects, I can appreciate knowing I have a website like Brilliant to help me brush up on things I'm not as familiar with in those subjects, especially when I need to learn them quickly. I encourage you to sign up for Brilliant today using the link brilliant.org/EmperorTigerStar, which is also posted in the description. The first 200 people to use the link will get 20% off their membership, so sign up quickly. Thanks again to Brilliant. So in 1871, the US tried to open up trade with Korea again and sent their ambassador to China, Frederick Lowe. They also wanted Frederick to see if he could find out what happened to the General Sherman. Frederick was not successful in either case. Korean officials finally realized that the General Sherman was American, but didn't want to inform Frederick on the ship's fate because, based on other events, they didn't want to be imposed a massive indemnity. Frederick was also told that American warships would not be allowed to go up the Han River, as all foreign ships were banned from traveling up that river. Now, you'd think, please don't put warships in the rivers of my own country would be a well-understood and common-sense request to follow. However, the United States didn't listen, and on June 1st of 1871, 5 warships were sent to the area anyway, and 2 of them were fired upon by coastal Korean guns as a result. The Korean firepower wasn't really enough to cause any sort of damage, but Americans were for some reason still shocked. Korea sent them letters basically saying, "We warned you, you're breaking Korean law, please go away." And they also finally told them about what happened to the General Sherman. The Americans then decided to demand an apology for both the sudden attack and what happened to the General Sherman within 10 days or face the consequences. After 10 days of no response, the US fired back on those forts. After destroying those forts, they attacked Korean garrisons on Ganhwa Island, using howitzer artillery to keep Korean forces at bay, while US ground forces stormed the Citadel Fortress on that island. Korean forces were armed with matchlocks, which at least meant they could fire back, but the US forces were armed with Remington rolling block rifles, which meant the reloading times were so different that the US was basically able to overrun the entire citadel within 15 minutes, captured the general's flag, and inflict 243 deaths, capturing 20, all while only losing 3 men. After this battle, the Americans thought surely Korea would be intimidated enough to open up for trade, and even considered using the 20 hostages as bargaining chips. Korea still said no, and apparently even told them that they were welcome to keep the wounded prisoners anyway. The US kept its ships in place all the way until July 1st, hoping Korea would change its mind. They didn't. And eventually the US just gave up and left. So the fighting was an American victory, but Korea remained isolationist and would not trade with America. And in fact, these events convinced them to remain isolationist even more. It wouldn't be until 1876 when they would open up, and that was thanks to Japan. Well, Japan threatening them with bombarding their capital, but still thanks to Japan nonetheless. And the US would finally have a treaty of trade with Korea of its own in 1882. Regardless, this whole mess was still, in terms of achieving its goals, a failure for the US. Although they at least found out what happened to the General Sherman. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Obviously, it'd be great if you liked and subscribed, but I also want to point out that this channel does have a Patreon, and any support of this channel really helps going towards keeping this channel, well, going. And I want to thank all the generous people who have joined so far, which you can see listed here. In the meantime, I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.